I never imagined that the morning of my wedding would unfold with a moment that felt so brutally surreal, it stole the air from my chest. My name is Bethany 28, living in Santa Fe, and I had spent months building a day meant to celebrate love commitment and the tiny bit of faith I still carried in my family. Right before I stepped into the dressing room to finalize my veil, my phone lit up with a message from my parents. I opened it without hesitation, expecting a simple check-in or maybe a reminder to breathe. Instead, I read a sentence that felt like a slap delivered without warning. "We're in Paris, nobody cares about your little wedding party." The words sat there cold and intentional, as if they had rehearsed the cruelty. Before I could process the shock tightening every muscle in my body, another notification appeared. It was from my sister, and her message cut through whatever disbelief remained. "Your wedding looks like a circus, Bethany." I stared at the screen while my pulse climbed high enough to drown out the quiet bustle of the room. The insults carved into the part of me that had still hoped they might show up, even if only out of obligation. I swallowed the hurt and forced myself to breathe, because there was no time to fall apart. Guests were arriving, music was starting, and I had to walk down that aisle whether my family respected me or not. I told myself I could fall apart later, but in that moment I had to pretend none of this was happening, even though it already felt like the ground had shifted. If you want to know how this story spiraled into something far bigger than a ruined wedding morning, stay with me, because the truth did not stop with those messages. 3 months before the wedding, everything still felt calm enough for me to believe the celebration would unfold with warmth instead of tension. I had spent the entire week preparing the initial outline of the ceremony and rehearsal dinner because I wanted my family to receive the news in a thoughtful and organized way. When I finally gathered enough confidence to send the message, I wrote each detail with the hope that they would sense how meaningful their presence would be on the most important day of my life. I told Mom and Dad about the venue in Santa Fe, the date we had chosen after weeks of coordination, and the reason I wanted them beside me during the ceremony. I also mentioned my sister Helena because I hoped she would be willing to participate in a small part of the rehearsal dinner. I crafted the message with care because I wanted them to feel that this invitation carried more than information. It carried a piece of my heart that still wished for connection. Their responses arrived an hour later. Mom replied first with a brief note that resembled a polite acknowledgement rather than genuine enthusiasm. She mentioned that the date sounded fine and that they would try to be there. Dad followed with a message that felt even more distant. He wrote that it was an important milestone and that they would mark it on their calendar. No additional questions. No curiosity about the preparations. No sense of involvement. It felt as though they were checking a box rather than receiving an invitation from their daughter. When Helena replied, her message created a different kind of distance. She told me she was busy with work and would see if she could arrange her schedule. I felt a quiet sting because her words made me realize how little space I occupied in her life. She did not ask where the ceremony would take place, or how I was handling the preparations. She did not even ask about my dress or the guest list. Every reply carried a cold neutrality that made me feel as though I were an outsider observing my own family from a far corner of the room. I tried to remain hopeful and reminded myself that they might simply be tired or preoccupied. I wrote another message explaining how much the day meant to me and how deeply I wished for their presence. I chose my words carefully so I would not sound demanding or emotional. I only wanted them to understand that this moment represented more than a ceremony. It was the beginning of a life I hoped to share with them as well. Even so, my message received the same minimal responses, which made the silence between our lines heavier than before. Despite the unease forming inside me, I convinced myself that everything would change once the date approached. People became distracted, and families sometimes slipped into routine patterns without malicious intent. I believed they would show up because this was my wedding, and despite the cracks beneath our interactions, some part of me still trusted that they cared enough to be present. I carried that belief with determination even when the distance in their replies whispered a different truth. 1 week before the wedding, the rhythm of preparation filled each day with a mixture of excitement and cautious hope. I spent the morning finalizing the seating chart with my husband Mason, who had been patient through every detail I adjusted. We reviewed the ceremony layout together because we wanted the celebration to reflect the life we were building as partners. He asked gentle questions about my family's preferences since he assumed they would want comfortable seating near the front. His sincerity made me wish even more that they would show a fraction of the enthusiasm he had shown from the beginning. I felt a growing tension behind the quiet tasks that filled the afternoon. Something urged me to confirm the arrangements with my parents, and although my heart tightened at the thought of calling them, I dialed Mom first. She answered with a tone that seemed distracted rather than warm. I explained that the ceremony planner needed the final list of reserved seats, and I asked whether she and Dad preferred aisle placement or a different view. Her reply arrived after a pause that stretched longer than I expected. She told me they had not discussed it and that I should place them wherever it was convenient. There was no follow-up question, no sign that she felt included in the moment, and the distance in her words settled heavily on my chest. I tried Dad next because I hoped he might show more interest. He answered yet. The call carried the same cool detachment. I repeated my question because I wanted to give him the chance to express any preference at all. His response matched Mom's in tone and emptiness. He said they would sit anywhere and that I should not worry about such things. It was the type of comment meant to sound supportive, but it only made me feel as though the ceremony existed on the edge of their concerns, instead of within their hearts. My phone vibrated shortly after I ended the call. It was the family group chat. A set of photos appeared from Helena. Each image displayed a different angle of a hotel room with tall windows followed by shots of a guided tour brochure and a detailed Paris itinerary. The message contained no explanation of departure dates or reasons for the trip. I stared at the images while questions crashed through my thoughts. The trip seemed elaborate, and the excitement in the photos was undeniable. A heavier silence followed when neither Mom nor Dad reacted to my earlier confirmation message, yet both of them responded beneath Helena's pictures. Mom added a line about how wonderful the view looked, while Dad commented about how much he had wanted to visit that district. Their remarks glowed with enthusiasm that had never appeared in any of our conversations about the wedding. The contrast between their joyful interactions and their disregard for my message left me grappling with a feeling I had tried to ignore for months. I waited for someone to ask about the ceremony, or to acknowledge that the date was approaching, but no such message arrived. The omission felt intentional, although I tried to convince myself otherwise. I whispered to Mason that maybe they were preparing a surprise, or focusing on a gift, rather than on conversations. He listened without judgment and reminded me that hope was not foolish, even when evidence suggested the opposite. A quiet ache settled in the space between anticipation and disappointment. I tried to focus on the practical tasks still waiting for me because the distraction softened the unease. Even so, every unread message from my family created a deeper hollow inside me. I wanted to believe they cared, yet their silence had begun to reshape the story I told myself about our bond. The wedding was only 1 week away, and despite my efforts to remain optimistic, the distance between us had never felt more visible. When the wedding day finally arrived, I stepped into the venue with a fragile belief that everything would somehow fall into place. I held on to the faint hope that my parents and Helena would appear at the last minute, even if they had spent weeks offering cold replies and scattered silence. I reminded myself that people sometimes behave differently when confronted with the significance of a milestone, and I tried to trust that they would not abandon a moment meant to be shared by family. The coordinator guided me toward the entrance where the ceremony would begin. Guests filled the aisles with warm conversations that created an atmosphere of celebration rather than tension. Several friends approached to compliment the dress I had chosen after months of indecision, and their kindness eased some of the unease that had followed me since I woke. I scanned the room in small glances, searching for familiar faces, even though I knew the odds were no longer in my favor. I told myself they might be delayed by traffic or miscommunication, and I clung to that thought because the alternative felt unbearable. As the music signaled the start of the procession, the coordinator instructed me to walk when ready. I steadied my breath and stepped forward, hoping the moment would drown out my doubts. The guests rose in unison, forming a path that should have felt comforting. Instead, my attention drifted toward the reserved seats in the front row, the ones I had carefully chosen for my parents and Helena. The sight of those empty chairs stopped something inside me. They were arranged neatly untouched and so still that they almost seemed to echo their absence. The blow landed with a force I had not prepared for, unraveling the confidence I had rehearsed all morning. A few guests noticed the emptiness and exchanged glances that carried questions they did not dare to voice. Their hesitation filled the air with an awkward heaviness that deepened the ache already forming within my chest. I lifted my chin, because I knew dissolving under their eyes would shatter the ceremony I had longed for. Tears gathered near the surface, yet I refused to let them fall. I had promised myself that I would not allow anyone's neglect to ruin the commitment I was making. When I reached Mason, he took my hand with a steadiness that grounded me. His eyes searched mine as though he could see the storm building behind them. The gentle pressure of his grip reminded me that I was not alone, even if the people who had raised me had chosen not to stand beside me. His quiet strength allowed me to recover enough composure to proceed with the vows we had written together. Each line felt heavier than I expected, not because they were difficult to speak, but because they contrasted sharply with the silence I had received from my own family. Throughout the ceremony, I maintained a smile that never reached the place where joy should have lived. I moved through each ritual with deliberate grace, because I wanted our guests to remember the beauty of the day, not the absence that haunted the front row. Mason's family radiated warmth, and their presence softened the edges of my disappointment, yet nothing could completely erase the hollow space carved by those who should have cared most. During the reception, laughter and music filled the room, though I drifted in and out of the celebration. Guests approached with congratulations and heartfelt wishes, and I responded with practiced gratitude that hid the turmoil beneath my exterior. I fulfilled traditions, greeted relatives, and posed for photos, all while wondering how my parents could be tasting pastries in Paris, while I stood at my own wedding feeling abandoned. The night continued as planned, but an unshakable emptiness followed me through every moment. I had envisioned a memory stitched together by family and love, yet what remained was a reminder that even the most meaningful days can be shaped by the people who refuse to show up. That night, when the music faded and the last guests left the reception hall, I finally allowed myself to search for the truth I had tried to avoid. The quiet that followed the celebration felt different from exhaustion. It carried the weight of unanswered questions that had stayed with me the entire evening. I slipped away to the bridal suite because I needed a moment to breathe without pretending everything was fine. My dress felt heavier than it had that morning, and, although the room was still filled with flowers, nothing eased the heaviness inside me. I took out my phone and called Mom first, hoping she might explain what had happened or offer some sign that they had at least attempted to be there. The call rang until it disconnected without a response. I tried Dad next, my voice already trembling before the second ring. His phone also went to voicemail. I waited a few minutes and called again, even though a part of me knew the outcome would not change. The silence on the other end became louder each time I heard the unanswered ringing, turning into a confirmation that they had never planned to come. I returned to the family group chat because I needed clarity, even if it came in the form of painful truth. My message asked where they were and whether something unexpected had prevented them from attending. The text showed as seen, yet no one responded. The small read receipt, a simple indicator that they had looked at my message, struck with a force that ripped apart the last bit of optimism I had been holding. I stared at the screen long enough for the brightness to sting my eyes, but I refused to look away because avoiding it would feel like letting them hide from what they had done. A notification from my best friend Olivia appeared while I was still in the chat window. She asked whether I was alone, and before I could answer, she sent a link to Helena's newest post. I tapped it expecting to see something trivial, but the page opened to a series of photos from Paris. Helena posed in front of a landmark with Mom and Dad smiling behind her. The caption joked about family adventures and included comments filled with emojis that celebrated the trip. My breath caught as I scrolled further. Video clips showed them eating pastries, touring galleries, and laughing together under bright city lights. It was impossible to pretend the timing was accidental. The realization settled painfully. Their absence at my wedding had not been a misunderstanding or a scheduling issue. It had been a choice they made together long before the ceremony began. Olivia sent another message asking whether I was okay, but I could not describe the combination of betrayal and clarity washing over me. The truth was now undeniable in a way that made my chest feel tight, as though the room had lost its air. A new message finally appeared in the family group chat. Mom wrote the exact line I had seen in the hook. "We're in Paris. Nobody cares about your little wedding party." Seconds later, Dad reacted with a heart emoji as if the sentiment were harmless. I waited, thinking that maybe one of them would soften the words with an explanation. Before I could gather a response, Helena added, "Your wedding looked like a circus, Bethany." The cruelty felt deliberate, sharpened by their willingness to say it publicly in a space meant for family. My hands shook as I stared at the messages. I no longer wanted answers from them because their words were answers on their own. I opened the screenshots tool and captured every message, including the read receipts and the comments beneath Helena's post. I began writing a long statement explaining what had happened, choosing each sentence carefully because I needed the truth to stand without exaggeration. When the post was complete, I tagged all three of them and pressed share. Then I turned off my phone because the only thing left to do was step away from the people who had chosen to step away from me. The quiet that settled over the apartment felt strangely heavy, and I took a slow breath before reaching for my phone because I already sensed that the world outside had shifted overnight. The moment I touched the screen, the vibration started again, a constant pulse that made my stomach knot, with a mixture of dread and something close to disbelief. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains as notification after notification stacked across the screen, each one confirming that the post I had written had traveled far beyond anything I had expected. The numbers kept climbing while I stared at them, almost forgetting to breathe, as thousands of reactions appeared from people across Santa Fe who had read every word. Messages poured in from acquaintances, former classmates, old co-workers, and distant relatives who had stumbled across the post, and nearly all of them offered sympathy and shock because none of them had imagined that my family would choose a vacation over my wedding. Their concern made my chest tighten because the sincerity in their words contrasted sharply with the silence I had endured for so long. They told me I deserved better, that no bride should walk down the aisle while wondering why her own family refused to stand beside her, and reading those messages brought a strange mix of comfort and sadness. It was the first time I truly felt seen, and the realization lingered while the phone continued to vibrate without pause. I had barely scrolled through half of the notifications when the missed calls appeared, each one labeled with the same two names that had haunted my screen the previous night. Mom had called 10 times, Dad even more, and the few voicemail previews visible on the lock screen revealed tones that carried no trace of remorse. Their voices, sharp and urgent, accused me of humiliating them because my post had reached the community and made people question their absence. The irony pressed against my ribs as I listened to the first voicemail, because they spoke as though the problem was never their decision to avoid the wedding but my decision to reveal the truth. They called my actions dramatic and irresponsible, insisting that I had twisted the story to make them appear uncaring, yet every sentence in their messages confirmed exactly what I had written. I let the voicemails play without replying because responding would only invite another round of justifications that ignored everything I felt. I moved to the message inbox and my throat tightened again when I saw a new notification from Helena. Her words were cold enough to make my fingers stiffen around the phone, and she accused me of tarnishing the family name and embarrassing them in front of friends who had seen the post. She insisted that I had exaggerated, that I had turned a small misunderstanding into a public spectacle, and she framed her own choices as harmless while ignoring the pain she caused. The dismissive tone in her message pulled something sharp inside me, yet it also made my thoughts unexpectedly clear, because their attempts to shift the blame revealed that none of them were willing to acknowledge what they had done. It became obvious that the anger filling their messages stemmed from the reactions of the community, not from any genuine understanding of how deeply they had hurt me. I placed the phone face down on the table and inhaled slowly, choosing silence, because silence felt safer than engaging with people who only reached out when confronted by consequences. Their calls came again, but I let them ring unanswered, because some truths no longer needed explanations, and the weight of their absence at my wedding was already undeniable. A week after everything unfolded, I watched Mom and Dad walk into the small cafe where they insisted we should meet, and the tense silence that followed their arrival made it painfully clear that this conversation would not bring the clarity they claimed to offer. They sat across from me with expressions that tried to resemble concern, although there was a sharper tone in their posture that reminded me of all the previous moments when my feelings had been treated as inconveniences they never wanted to address. Mom was the first to break the silence, saying they deserved a chance to explain themselves, yet her voice carried the impatience of someone who believed they were being forced into an unpleasant task. Dad nodded in agreement while insisting that the trip to Paris had already been booked long before the wedding date, and that they assumed I would be reasonable enough to understand the situation without turning it into a public scandal. Their words sounded rehearsed, and the way they avoided meeting my eyes made the entire explanation feel like a performance intended to shift responsibility away from them. Before I could respond, Helena walked in and joined the conversation with the confidence of someone who believed she had done nothing wrong. She positioned herself next to them and immediately claimed that I had exaggerated every detail, insisting that my post had destroyed the family more than their absence ever could. She spoke as if my pain was an inconvenience that disrupted her carefully curated image, and the irritation in her tone revealed how deeply she resented being confronted with the truth. I listened to all three of them defend their choices with circular explanations that never acknowledged what I had actually gone through, and their attempts to portray themselves as misunderstood victims made it clear they had no intention of taking responsibility. When Mom insisted that I should apologize for embarrassing them online, something in me finally settled. I realized that the conversation was not about understanding or healing, but about restoring their comfort at the expense of my dignity. I told them calmly and clearly that the issue was never the trip itself, but the deliberate way they had chosen to hide their plans while leaving me to believe that they cared about the most important day of my life. I explained how their silence on the wedding day had carved a wound that would not fade, simply because they wished to pretend it had never happened. Their expressions tightened as I spoke, yet none of them offered acknowledgement or regret. Instead, they continued to insist that I had reacted too strongly, and that the entire situation could have been avoided if I had remained quiet. By the end of the conversation, I realized I no longer wanted to fight for understanding from people who refused to see me beyond the version of family obligation they had created. I told them that I needed distance for my own well-being, and that I would not allow myself to be part of relationships that demanded silence in exchange for conditional affection. Their shock was immediate, yet none of them attempted to stop me from standing up to leave. When I walked away from that cafe, I felt a quiet relief settle over me. For the first time in years, I no longer felt trapped in a cycle of trying to earn affection that was never freely offered. The weight of their expectations slipped away, leaving space for a steadier version of myself to grow, and the silence that followed felt more peaceful than any apology they could have given. A few months later, I recognized how much my life had changed since the wedding, and how steadily my days had begun to settle into a quiet rhythm that finally felt protective rather than lonely. I poured my energy into my work in Santa Fe and appreciated the supportive culture that surrounded me because the people I interacted with every day valued honesty and empathy more than appearances. That environment helped me breathe in, a way I had not experienced when my emotions were tied to the shifting moods of my parents, or Helena and I slowly felt my confidence returning with a steadiness that surprised me. Mason and I built routines that made our small home feel grounded, and those routines taught me how peaceful a marriage could be when both partners respected each other's boundaries. I noticed how different it felt to come home without preparing myself for criticism or unpredictable comments, because he offered reassurance whenever I doubted the decisions that had led me to distance myself from my family. His presence gave me space to rediscover interests I had ignored for years, and the encouragement he offered helped me rebuild parts of myself that had gone silent under the pressure of constantly seeking approval from people who rarely offered it. No one from my family attempted to contact me during those early months, and the absence of their voices created an unfamiliar calm that gradually turned into something comforting rather than painful. I realized that silence can become a form of healing when it comes from people who never acknowledged the harm they caused, because I could finally recognize that their distance protected me rather than wounded me. I no longer waited for apologies or explanations, because those expectations had kept me trapped in a cycle where I minimized my own feelings in order to maintain bonds that had never been stable. The consequences of their choices emerged slowly throughout Santa Fe, and every new detail confirmed that the distance I created was necessary. Several coworkers told me that community groups had circulated my post in discussions about emotional neglect, and those conversations painted my parents and Helena in an unflattering light that carried farther than anyone anticipated. My father faced tense meetings at his workplace after colleagues questioned the judgment he displayed in abandoning a daughter on her wedding day, while my mother found long-standing social circles closing their doors when friends refused to support behavior that dismissed a child during a major milestone. Helena suffered the sharpest reactions because her online presence made her comments impossible to deny, and several professional contacts withdrew collaboration offers after learning how proudly she had mocked her sister. None of those outcomes brought me satisfaction, yet they helped me understand the cost of cruelty when it is exposed to a community that values decency. I did not celebrate their embarrassment or the strain they encountered because I knew that resentment would only weigh me down. Instead, I acknowledged that consequences can unfold without my involvement, and those consequences served as reminders that boundaries matter when people refuse to treat one another with dignity. As the weeks continued, I noticed how rarely I thought about whether they felt regret, because regret mattered far less than the peace I finally gained. I invested my time into friendships that offered reciprocity, and into projects that strengthened my sense of purpose, and the distance from my family created room for healthier relationships to grow. I no longer felt obligated to carry the emotional weight of their expectations, and the clarity that followed allowed me to appreciate the life I was building with Mason without the shadow of constant judgment. When I reflected on everything that happened, I realized that the absence of chaos did not mean something was missing. It meant I had stepped away from people who thrived on conflict. The steadiness I felt each morning provided the reassurance I needed, and I embraced the understanding that my well-being no longer depended on whether my family approved of my choices. There are moments in life when distance becomes the only path toward emotional protection, and the decision to choose peace over familiarity requires more courage than many people realize. I learned that boundaries are not acts of punishment, but acts of self-preservation, especially when repeated harm becomes normalized. Stepping away allowed me to rebuild my sense of worth and help me understand that respect must be mutual in any relationship, even when that relationship involves family. Thank you for listening to my story and for allowing me to share this journey with honesty and vulnerability. Your presence means more than you know, and I hope my experience encourages you to reflect on the boundaries that protect your own well-being. I would love to hear your thoughts, so please share your perspective in the comments and let others learn from your strength and insight.